Welcome back to the Demystify Sci podcast. I'm Anastasia.
I'm Shiloh.
And today we are talking economics with Dr. Randall Wray, who is a professor at Bard College. He is also the senior fellow of the Levy Institute, which is also Bard College. He worked at the University of Kansas, where he was colleagues with one of our favorite economists, Michael Hudson. And we really wanted to pick his brain about modern monetary theory. We've had a couple of conversations on the show about modern monetary theory, and I don't know about you guys, but I would always walk away from them with this feeling that I didn't have a full grasp of how the ideas all fit together. And even when we talk to Hudson, there's this sense that, debt is really important, that money isn't what we think it is, that banking does a weird thing that nobody really understands, and I didn't have a full cohesive narrative that I could tell you. So today, we link all of these different pieces together, and we don't really get to modern monetary theory until the very, very end. And so it ends up being really interesting because we intended to discuss more about modern monetary theory, but in the end, we got a lesson about the history of economics, the history of money, the history of banking, that gives us the platform to now be able to stand on it and say, okay, what are our next questions about modern monetary theory and the future? Because the value of any theory has to do with the kinds of predictions that it makes. And next time when we talk to Dr. Wray, we can see how they pan out over time.
Yeah, I think mainly we debunked a lot of myths about what money is, where it comes from, and the history was just absolutely fascinating to me. So I think you guys are going to really enjoy that. Speaking of money, this podcast is entirely supported by listeners like you. We don't sell anything. We don't have any sponsors, and we're going to keep it that way. So the best thing you could do is shave off a tiny piece of your money, whatever's coming into you, a couple dollars, whatever it is, it adds up. And we're really powering this program at this point entirely by patron support at patreon.com/demystifysci. It's also really cool to join our Patreon because you can participate in our community, which means we hang out every week. Every Sunday, get together, chop it up about all our favorite subjects, and I'd love to see you there, and you can contribute your voice and just help us keep the lights on here, and ideally help us grow this project. We're also doing conferences, right? We had an incredible conference this last April in Austin, Texas. We got together, made some friends, and we're doing it again next year. The weekend of June 13th, we're going to be meeting up in Portugal, and we have some of our favorite alternative cosmologists coming together, and we're going to be discussing crises in cosmology. And we're going to release the names of all those guests very soon, but we're not going to be selling tickets until November. Nonetheless, put it on your calendar because you're not going to want to miss that. And I think we're only going to sell something like 40 tickets, so get in line. Actually, if you're a patron too, you can move to the front of the line. So that's another reason to give a couple dollars right now.
Oh yeah, definitely. Ticket sales will go first to patrons once we have it established. Let's see what other announcements. Oh, if you don't like Patreon for whatever reason, we have a PayPal donation link down at the bottom. We are selling t-shirts that are actually at cost. I think the shop allows us to, the lowest price that we can set it on is like 50 cents of profit per shirt. So that's what it's set at right now. If you wear that out into the world, people will see it. We're going to add a couple of more designs. We're playing with colors and arrangements, and so keep an eye on those. You can tell somebody about the podcast. If you have an episode that you really love, you can tell somebody to listen to that episode, and that will very often lead into a deeper exploration. We have tons of people who show up, listen to a single episode, and then just work their way through the archives, which is very cool. Lastly, we have super thanks enabled, which is like a thing in the YouTube comments that you can apparently just make small donations with, which is very cool. And
yeah, you can just subscribe, make sure you do all those things. They seem insignificant, but they're completely free to you and they help us a ton. I know you probably, the whole subscription basis makes no sense. You don't even see the videos from your subscriptions. It's really just a way for our guests to see how much impact they're going to have when they come on the show. So make sure to subscribe if you aren't already. It costs you nothing. It helps us a lot. And then you could rate and review the podcast too over at any of the podcast platforms. It's really cool. We actually hit number 18 in the US for science podcasts this last month. That was really exciting. All these things help us really be able to bring in better and better conversations to the show. So please support the podcast in any way you can. Otherwise, enjoy the conversation today. We'll see you next time.
Before we see you next time, there's one other announcement.
I'll edit it.
One last thing that I want to mention is that one of our guests, Gopi Vijaya, is holding his conference, The Renewal of Science, in Menlo Park, California, from October 31st to either November 1st or 2nd. It's going to be a couple days of alternative scientific thinkers on the topic of things like light, electromagnetism, the solar system, and I think that if you're in the area, you should try to come out because it's going to be a really good weekend of people coming together over topics that they love, over topics that we love, and we really want to support Gopi in his project.
And we're going to be there, or at least one of us will be there, so we'd love to see you.
With that said, enjoy the conversation with Dr. Randall Wray, and we will see you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
Let us see in the dark.
I think it might be a really good place to begin just asking why the ordinary person should care about the origins of money. We all use money all the time. We assume it to have some intrinsic value. It has meaning in our lives, obviously, but why should we concern ourselves with the origins of money?
Start with a quote from Joan Robinson, who is a famous economist, obviously a woman, and should have won a Nobel Prize. Anyway, she said, the reason why you should study economics is so that economists cannot lie to you. And I would say the same thing about money. Why does an average person need to understand something about the origins and nature and possibilities of money and the monetary system? The reason is because politicians are flat out lying all the time about it. And if people understood money's nature, where it comes from, and what it can be used for, they would not tolerate this. Life could be very much better for everyone.
And so in conversations about money and the origin of money, there's always these two perspectives. One perspective is that money is created by markets or by states, and for just having something that represents wealth. And the other is that it represents debt. And a lot of historians have written about that, and I'm trying to understand, why is that so important? Like, why is understanding money in the lens of debt the foundation for the development of these is it heterodox economics? Like, why is it so important for for these theories?
Right. It's not either or. Both of those things are true. So, money is debt, and debt has to have another side to it because it is also a credit. If I hold your debt, it's a credit to me and it is a debt to you. And all money, every form that it takes, is a debt and a credit. And so this dichotomy is just not true. So yes, banks create money. The state creates money. And we can talk about how the state does that. And you can create money. Anyone can create money. My professor, Hyman Minsky, used to always say, anyone can create money. The problem is to get it accepted. You can write, I owe you $5 or £5. And if someone will take it, you have created money, and it is your debt and it is their credit.
This is like the Bitcoin revolution.
Well, Bitcoin is not a debt. Bitcoin is not money.
Okay, let's explore that. Should we get into that right now, or should we wait for it?
I mean, we could come back to it if
let's
it's
come
not
back
appropriate
to it.
to right
Bitcoin's
now.
not money.
I think the dichotomy that you set up, so you sent us a couple chapters, I believe, of a book that is not yet published. Is that correct? And so you set up this dichotomy between the idea that seems to be classical, where people understood money to be the product of a barter economy that was this stand-in for people's individual trade. And you seem to make the argument, along with Michael Hudson, who we've had on the show number of times actually, that it's more of a ledger system that evolved over time into something with, eventually to central banks, which I hope we have time to talk about because that's one of the most impenetrable topics for me personally. But I think that that's the dichotomy that needs to be dispelled to some extent.
So a lot of people think that the most important characteristic about money is that it's valuable and that possibly it could lose its value and then, we're in big trouble and all that. There are lots of valuable things that are not money. So gold is valuable in part because it has some useful characteristics and looks good in your teeth and on your finger. And so, it's been prized probably all the way back to the very beginning of humans. But that does not make it money. It is not money. So money is a debt. It's an IOU. But you want some evidence of that debt. Okay, so you could say, here, I will owe you $5. Well, I would like a record of that so that I can come back to you and say, remember? So it helps us to remember things. And so we find ways to record that indebtedness. And that's what Hudson means by a ledger. Okay, so in the old days, we can find these stones that have hash marks in them that we can date to 50,000 years ago.
Oh,
Made by humans. Okay, they're obviously intentional scratches. What were they doing? Now that we don't know for sure, but it seems like probably counting and keeping a record.
And it's
Okay?
interesting because you make the case that at the beginning, this was not an abstraction. It's literally like you have in front of you like 10 bundles of wheat, and it's not like you're storing in your mind the idea that the 10 bundles of wheat are somehow not right in front of you and that the hash marks represent abstract numbers. It's literally like one hash per each bundle, theoretically. And then eventually it develops into something that is sight unseen. But at the beginning, it's this idea of saying, okay, this is how much we have right now, and we need to remember that. So let's mark it down.
It's crazy to imagine people 50,000 years ago even having bundles of wheat. It must have been. I mean, we don't think about the birth of agriculture
really
until much, much, much later.
Okay, well, let's say like mammoth tusks.
No, it could have been chickens or whatever. But the truth is we don't know what they were doing. So we are speculating. It seems like counting, and of course, counting leads to accounting. They were accounting for something. Exactly what we don't know. But the next step was to actually make little symbols that sort of looked like what they represented. And so we have that 8,000 years ago, where they have a little thing that looks like a goat, a little thing that looks like a bushel of wheat, and so on. And they were counting those, keeping track. And for safekeeping, what they did was they pushed them inside a hollow ball of clay. Okay, and so you could break it open and then count the things that are inside. So it was definitely a method of record keeping.
Info security built in too. That's really interesting.
Yeah, well, counterfeiting, it seems counterfeiting has always been a major problem. And so this could avoid counterfeiting. But then they figured out, you don't actually have to keep a whole bunch of the tokens. You can just press a token into a piece of clay that becomes a tablet and press different tokens for different things. And you could just keep that clay tablet. You don't need the tokens. Okay, and then just in case there could be counterfeiting, they would put those inside of a case that could be broken open to get the tablet that's inside.
So
And,
I don't totally understand how that prevents counterfeiting.
oh, someone could substitute and say that I only owed you 5, and you have added another one.
I
Okay.
see.
And when they're doing the tablets, someone could make a fake tablet. So you keep it inside a case. That's the speculation, why they had encased tablets.
Which
Seems
brings
to
a
be,
real vital role for some central authority, right? You need a temple structure, some priest class, some hierarchical system to keep those, and it has to be trusted too, right?
Oh, so the tablets are presumably kept by somebody else. They're not like kept by the merchant and the
so
debtor.
Michael Hudson, who you've had, is an expert on this. And yes, it seems that these likely were stored in the temples.
Hmm.
And so anyway, at this stage, uh, this is the very beginning of writing. And the first they're pressing tokens in, then they figure out you don't need to press a token in. I can use a stylus and draw it, and then the clay hardens. And then that's how cuneiform writing developed. It became more and more stylistic. And we can read those tablets, the clay Shubati tablets. So we know what they were recording, and it was debts. Writing was invented to keep track of debts. It's
That's a
invented
crazy
by
theory.
accountants.
Yeah. Wait, we have to pause to take that in. So the argument is that written language followed from debts. So this is probably by itself a really good reason to understand the origin of money, because it's so primary that it supersedes even our need to communicate stories through written language.
Yeah, they were
Let's
like,
see.
everybody can
So,
remember the story, but the exact and precise number of things that you owe me in order for me to be able to survive into next season by having enough seed or ale or whatever else, like that somehow seems to be of primary importance. They're like, anybody can remember a story. It's probably not life or death, but this actually might be life or death.
so we can get into where this probably came from. But what I wanted to emphasize is that these original debts are not in money form. They're debts. And the our argument is that money developed out of the debts.
Well, they're stuff, debts of stuff. It's like
Yes, they
sheaves
are
of
Because they're
wheat.
not tokenized. Is that why they're not considered money?
there is no what we call unit of account to measure the size of the debts.
Hmm.
You owe me 3 pigs, or you owe me 3 bushels of wheat. That's what you have to deliver back to me. Okay. But somewhere in the distant past, they came up with a unit of measurement that I could apply to both pigs and wheat and say, oh, that is 5 debens, or that one is 3 shekels. Um, all the early measuring units were based on grain, which gives us some kind of a hint that they started making grain equivalents for every possible thing that you might owe. And that becomes a money of account.
So it's really interesting that you say that grain is the center, because I imagine that in those days, grain is and this is going to sound crazy, but grain is the equivalent of petroleum. It's the thing that makes everything go. You have to feed your pigs grain. You have to feed your people grain. You have to put grain into the beer. You have to put grain into the field. Literally, the foundation of the society is grain. Like, how much grain do you need to feed a pig to get it to market? How much grain do you need to feed your soldier to get him to war? Is kind of the same question of like, how much energy do you need? And so it seems like at the very root of economics is this relationship between
Power supply,
like motive,
fuel,
fuel,
fuel.
accounting, and debt.
And I don't think it's too controversial that civilization comes out of agriculture and grain. So the first civilizations were based on grain. You needed grain to feed thousands of people, and you had to be productive enough to have elites who did not have to work to support themselves.
Mm.
And that's when you start developing civilization. You can have people who can focus on science, technology, the arts, religion, and so on, because you're so productive that you can support a population that basically doesn't do anything to survive.
Well, they're
Oh,
managerial to some extent, right? Yeah, I think I was just saying that you have the ability to have this managerial class, right? Some sort of hierarchy set up where people, their whole job is just to organize society to some extent.
And enrich themselves.
That too.
You get the rise of an upper class with the development of these grain societies. We get the rise of an upper class, and that's what we mean by civilization.
So you take civilization to be inherently this inequality?
Yes.
So,
That doesn't necessarily mean it can't. Some are more democratic than others. Some kinds of organized civilized societies are much more inclusive and less unequal than others. But yes, the rise of civilization is associated with the rise of inequality and the breakdown of tribal society. Tribal society is based on equality. Basically, everybody does the same thing. There could be division by gender, but if you're a female, you do this. If you're a male, you do this. And there is no upper class. So that's the difference between civilization and tribal society. And when we were talking about debts, these predate civilization. Tribal society had debts. The debts were a system in the German tribes is called Wehrgeld. And we know a lot about it because the Romans were civilized and the Germans were still tribal society, and they studied them to see how they operated and wrote it down. Of course, there's always some bias when you have a civilized society recording what a tribal society was like. I just read Columbus's log from his first voyage, and it's pretty amazing. The observations, because they try to interpret it, the way they understand the world. But Columbus really was trying hard to understand how the tribal societies in the Americas operated, just like Tacitus was trying to understand how the German tribal societies operated, and much later how Lewis Henry Morgan, the father of anthropology, studied American Indian societies in the 19th century. So anyway, we know tribal society has a system of debt, and it's mostly if I injure someone in your family, then my family owes your family. And they had a system of fines that you would have to pay. And one that almost everyone has heard of is called bride price. Okay, what was bride price? Well, we interpret it as you're buying a wife. That wasn't it at all. You're compensating a family for losing a female member of the family. Okay, and so you have to pay a bride price fine. But they had fines for everything. Any possible injury you might cause would have a particular fine you had to pay. So debts are as old as humans, as far as we know. And we know that chimpanzees have systems of debts too. A chimp will remember whether I helped fight off another chimp or not. If I helped fight off one, then I have a credit. And the chimp I help has a debt.
One thing you mentioned in here that was really fascinating was that the tribal societies would have designated rememberers for intergenerational
Yes.
debts. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, because they did not have writing. So writing comes with civilization. But they would remember what the system was, and there would be an appointed rememberer. And they also had to remember the stories of their origins, the genesis of where they came from. So people would memorize the stories and they would repeat the stories.
It's so funny to think of those stories as also keeping track of debts, because I'm like, man, you really better make sure you don't upset the guy who's remembering the debt that your family owes.
Yeah, a lot of power in that position.
Like, is there any indication of
Counterfeit
of
remembrances?
counterfeit remembrances, or is that just an impossible
Well,
story to tell?
that might be why there were scratches on rocks. We don't know for sure.
That's interesting. So basically, the idea is that, do you think that there's a relationship between debt and fairness?
Well, it comes out of that, yes. It's only fair if I killed your brother, maybe it's an accident, maybe it's not, that I should be in debt to your family, and my family should be in debt to your family. Why did they do this? Is to prevent the Hatfield and McCoys. Do you know what that is? I don't.
Yeah. It was,
That's
but I was. The reason I was pausing is I was like, well, the Hatfields and McCoys did eventually happen, so I suppose that it's a fallible system.
But they were kind of outside of the state, is I think the reason it happened. It's often given as the argument for why you need a hierarchy in general is because so that you don't get blood feuds. Some ruler can just say they can rule and adjudicate some matter, and that's the end of it. It doesn't continue into the future.
Can we briefly tell people what the Hatfield-McCoy feud was, so that they?
well, it's two. I actually don't know the details.
Yeah, I'd have to Wikipedia that one.
Two American families that carried on generation after generation because of something that had happened in the distant past, trying to get even. So yes, it was a sense of fairness, and this is why tribal societies invented Vergil, to prevent that from happening. Once you paid your debt, it's over, and the fight is not going to continue.
What did they pay in?
Well, if it's a goat, you've got to provide the goat. If it's a pig, you have to provide the pig. If it's bride price, they tell you exactly what you must pay. And once that's done, it's satisfied. You can't carry on some kind of a feud because you lost a woman to marriage.
And so, in some ways, everyone. So, when you have a society and there is a system of debts that is informed by what feels fair, you have a stable society, as long as everybody agrees on what's fair. And the minute that somebody's like, I don't think that this thing that we've established as being fair is very fair, and I'm going to do something about it, that feels like a point of fracture almost always.
See, in tribal society, you a tribe is comprised of gens, gens. You're all very closely related by blood. So these are like your cousins, aunts, uncles, and so on are in your gens. So it's within the family, and then you're related much more distantly to other gens. So you don't marry within your own gens, but you marry within your own tribe. And so we're all at least distantly related. And the tribe will have a public assembly that educates all those kinds of things. You say, well, I don't think it was fair. They're going to decide whether it was fair or not. And they can punish you. And the most extreme punishment is you're exiled. And if you're exiled, you're almost certainly going to die because humans are not capable of surviving on their own. So that's how they would settle it. If necessary, you'll just be exiled.
And so then we have that the formation at the base of this is also a mode of being able to settle what is fair in a way that everybody agrees with.
By the way, the Hatfield McCoy was over a hog originally.
It was over a what?
A hog, yeah. It's so archetypical, yeah.
That's funny. So yeah, you need a situation where you have you have a place where the group can come, the two families
Trusted
can,
institution.
a trusted institution, whether that's the tribal circle or the tribal council or some other form of governance, where people can come together and they can agree with what is fair in a way that everyone is satisfied. And if that breaks down, if you have a group that's like, no, I'm not satisfied and I can't influence the tribe in order to satisfy me, then that's probably the most fundamental fracture that a society can have.
And it must happen because we know that some peoples die out, disappear, or
Well,
they're absorbed into other groups.
or they
So,
form their own groups, right? Because if you have enough people that are like you called it the gens.
yeah.
So if you have a gens that's like, well, no, our sense of what is fair is different from what your sense of what is fair, and if there's enough of them, and the land is fertile enough, they can just go to the next river and be like, well, we're just going to be over here now, and we'll organize things according to our own rules.
And relations between tribes would have to be settled too. And so the Iroquois had a nation, which was a number of tribes, and they had a national assembly. The our forefathers who wrote the U.S. Constitution borrowed much of that from the Iroquois,
Hmm.
from their national constitution.
I was really struck. I was reading Jefferson's biography last month, and I was really struck that a lot of his debts were settled actually in bales of grain. Like he was paying for work at Monticello based on not money. And he did deal with money, and he was heavily indebted his whole life. But he was still paying in bushels of grain for most of his construction projects and things like that. That was really shocking to me.
Hmm.
Um, the colonies were short of money
I bet.
because they couldn't coin. And a lot of people think the colonies had tobacco money, but tobacco was never money. It was that you could settle debts using tobacco, and you knew the price of tobacco because it was set by the colony. And so I could pay my debts in tobacco if you were willing to accept tobacco, but it was denominated in Virginia pounds or whatever colony you were in.
And so nobody had Virginia pounds, but they had tobacco. And so there was a price of Virginia pounds for everything. And so it was like a second layer.
Transfer. There's a term used for this. Is it transference or something like that? I can't remember. The ability to translate between one unit and the other.
Well, if you have a price list, and Michael Hudson probably talked about this in Babylonia, the prices were set by the temple, and they would be posted on the column. So you knew what the price of everything was. You knew what the shekel price of a basket of grain would be, and so you could pay your debts in wheat. But it wasn't that wheat itself was money. The temple had chosen what the money of account would be, and then you had things priced in that money.
You make this interesting case that money at first was in denominations that were so large that it was highly unlikely that people themselves were using it.
Coins. So
Are we differentiating
people,
between coins and money?
Oh yeah.
but so the people imagined that everyone was using coins, and that the coins were the most commonly used form of money until fairly recently when we started using paper money. But that wasn't true. The coins were used for big payments because precious metal was too valuable. And so you couldn't go buy a beer with a metallic coin. You could buy 100 beers with a metallic coin. So most of the time, what you would do from Mesopotamian times all the way to the 14th century in England, when you went to the pub, The alewife, they were women, would just keep track. Chalkboard behind the bar, got your name, and we just put a mark down
The ancient
and
bar
just
tab.
accumulate.
Yeah.
What?
The ancient bar tab.
Yes, a bar tab. And just keep track. And at the end of the year, you most likely would pay in barley because that's what she needed to make more beer. So you would come with a few bushels of barley and you pay your beer tab at the end of the year. In 14th century, Marjorie McIntosh has studied this keeping tabs in England in the 14th century. She said it was very common to settle up only once every 2 years, not just at the bar, but for your debts. Carrying debts on a ledger was the normal way to buy stuff. And you might think, well, hold it. People would, after a year and a half, they might walk away. No, they couldn't do that. Everybody knew everybody. You could not just walk away from your debts. And so there was no credit risk. And so they were perfectly happy to just keep the tab and eventually you pay up.
I mean, the mobility is really limited. I mean, I suppose that there's individuals that you would be suspicious of, like somebody new in town might not be extended the same payment, but the idea of there being a lot of new people in town seems unlikely.
Much later, much later. Like you had to get into the Roman societies and stuff to get to that point.
But even maybe actually, so I don't know about this because from the model that I have in my mind is that like widespread mobility is tied to industrialization and the Industrial Revolution.
I think it's more just like war. Like people could earn their citizenship by fighting valiantly in a battle in Rome, for instance, and they could actually, maybe their kids would then have the opportunity, now that they're citizens, to participate in governance, and they could actually become part of the aristocracy in a few generations.
And so, how do we see these sorts of ledger systems changing when trust begins to not be a default, where you have war or you have large movements of population? What changes?
Okay, so let's back up a little bit. So, who probably would make payments on delivery? Merchants. Okay, long distance trade, going to one of the medieval fairs. Those are places where you would probably make the payment immediately. And you most likely would have made it in a bill of exchange, which were the common way to move goods around. It was bills of exchange. So for local business, yeah, you could just your IOU was good enough. Who was risky? Well, the king is very risky. Kings default. They also have a pretty easy way to get rid of debt. They kill the creditors. So, you know, the one you don't really want to trust is probably the king because they're sovereign. You say, nope, I don't know that anymore. Or, oh, that coin, no, that's only worth half as much now. Or those tally sticks, no, I'm not going to accept my tally sticks anymore, which is what the King of England did. Um, and so those were the risky ones. It's the opposite of what you might think. Your neighbor is okay. The king is not okay. And so part of the reason why we start getting the precious metal in the coins is because you don't really trust the king. And so, oh, I will accept your coin if there's a lot of gold in it. Because now, if you default on it and you won't accept it back in payment of taxes or fees and fines, at least I have something valuable. So,
How do they know? I mean, is this like just people like biting coins and stuff? Like, how do you actually know?
Yeah, it was, they knew how to rub them, and the coin exchangers uh, could give an estimate, but it's true that knowing exactly what the content was difficult. And the so you could increase the reputation of your coin if you set very high standards. And for example, the Venice and some Italian city-states were known for having very high standards in their coins. And so you could pretty much trust how much of the coin would be in there. The other thing you could do is make your own IOUs, whether they were coins or paper money, convertible on demand to gold. And that's how we get gold standards and silver standards. So the in the aftermath of I think it's King Charles, who defaults on his tally sticks. So tally sticks were a recording device. The king, let's say he wants a wagon, he would, and the wagon is worth a pound. The king would have the exchequer, which is the treasury, issue a tally stick with a 1 pound notch in it, and they split the stick in two so that the wagon seller gets half and the treasury keeps the other half. At tax time, when the wagon seller has to pay taxes, the exchequer goes from village to village to village collecting taxes. They would accept coins and tally sticks. And tally sticks, according to the historical records, were the majority. The majority of taxes paid in England were in the form of tally sticks. So you have a stock and a stub. We still use the term. We still use the term raise a tally. Raise a tally means telling the exchequer to go out and cut some tally sticks, right, from hazelwood trees, so that the king could spend. At tax time, then, they match them to make sure there was no counterfeiting. They have to match exactly. If you tried to add another notch in the stick to make it worth 2 pounds, you would get caught because they had to match exactly. And then the tax was paid. King Charles wanted coins because he wanted the metal. And so he refused to accept his own tally sticks. Parliament revolted and invited an invasion, and William of Orange took over. And that changed everything in England. It changed everything because
Is this from Saxony, or where's this invasion?
England.
But where's the invading force coming from? From within. It's a civil war.
Well, they Parliament invited him in to become the new king.
But do you know if is he coming from across the channel, or is he's from within Great Britain?
Yeah, but that now I'm an American, so I did not grow up reciting all of the kings of England like all the Brits do. But you know that all of the royal families were all linked by marriage, and they're a very incestuous group. So they're all related, and they move around a lot.
But he appears to have been born in France.
Okay.
So the Principality of Orange is now in southern France.
I see.
And so
he was invited in to take over by Parliament, but Parliament said, but we are taking much more power away from the crown. So this is so Parliament put him on a budget, which was pretty low, and they took more power over the purse, away from the crown, and Parliament becomes more important.
So this is probably a dumb question, but why would the tally sticks even worth something to begin with?
Why were they what?
Well, you say that the tally sticks were the way that the king, prior to William of Orange, collected the taxes. Why is the tally stick worth anything? Are you presenting something with the tally stick in hand?
Like, where does the trust come from?
No, I mean, like, we've been talking about the idea that the debt is settled in something that is useful, whether that's grain or pigs or milk or ale
Well,
or whatever.
that was true in tribal society. So the things that you use to pay debts for injuries that you cause are something that is useful. That's true. When we have a money of account and money records, it's valuable because it's denominated in the money of account. Now, what could you use a tally stick for? So I've sold my wagon. I have the half of a king's tally stick. What can I use it for? One thing I can use it for is to pay my own tax. At the end of the year, I can use that half of a tally stick to pay the king. But what if, I have a neighbor who has to pay a tax? Well, I can use the half of a tally stick I have and buy something from the neighbor. So the tally sticks are transferable. It's just like, you get a dollar bill, you can pay your tax, but you also can use it because other people have to pay a tax.
I
So
see.
the tally sticks could be transferable. They're valuable because in the end, somebody can pay a tax with them.
But what does the king do once he assembles all the sticks? Like, so okay,
Good
he's got like a
question.
room full of guys assembling sticks, and now he has a bunch of complete
That's
tally
right.
sticks.
So now he's got both halves, and the exchequer has gone all over the country to all these villages, collected all these tally sticks, matched them. They bring them back. What do they do with them? They burn them.
Why?
They burn them.
Why go through the process? Why go through the pain of it? If it's just if it's just sticks, and then at the end of this all, you burn it. Is it simply to provide a medium of exchange for people so that commerce can continue?
No, 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 not at all. It's because the king wanted a very high living standard.
Okay, unpack that.
And
Yeah, because how did what is he, what, yeah, but he's only gotten tally sticks. Like, is he
no,
building like a nice house from
no,
the tally
He got
sticks?
labor, I would say.
every tally stick he issued, he got something for it.
Ah,
He got his high living standard.
In the form of real tangible goods and services.
Yeah.
So this is one thing we kind of glossed over too. When he's talking about like a pound, the coin is like a pound coin. Is that referring to a physical weight of barley or something? Silver?
Okay, well, first, let's be a little more accurate. The pound was never coined. Shillings were coined.
mm.
Okay, and I'm American. I have no idea what a shilling is. It takes a bunch of them to make a pound. That's all I know. I think 20. So anyway, they never actually coined the pound. The pound was simply a measuring unit. Now in the United States, we do it differently. So we coined our dollar. But in England, the pound was strictly a measuring unit.
Of
It
money.
was the shillings. What?
Of money, not of anything in particular. It wasn't like a pound of wheat or something like that.
No, the word pound is a weight unit, just like all of the grain units. The lira is a weight unit. They're all weight units. The shekel,
Is
the
there a
mina,
weight of something that's used to
grain.
establish a grain? Okay, okay,
So it does
I mean,
trace back to grain.
they use the name. Okay, they use the same name. Why? Well, because everyone's used to that.
got it.
Okay, yeah, we have a mina measurement. We know what that is. It measures. It's a measurement unit like the inch or the meter, and so they use the same name.
And
Maybe
so,
in the beginning it was worth, a bushel of barley. but it becomes detached from that.
Okay, so are the tally sticks and the shillings and the pounds contemporaneous?
Are they what?
Are they at the same time?
Pounds and shilling? Yeah.
Oh no, pounds, shillings, and tally sticks. So, because the idea with the king and the tally sticks, you said he wants a high standard of living, and so basically what he's doing is he's creating this thing that he exchanges for some sort of labor, whether it's people who work for him, or people who farm for him, or people who fight for him. And at the end of the year, he's like, "Look, I'm going to give you this thing, and you have to give me this thing back because if you don't, you'll be punished." And so the motivating force is the fact that the king is powerful, the king can punish, and you're working for the king at under the thumb of the fact that he will hurt you if you don't give him back this thing. Okay. Are pounds and shillings also in circulation at this time, or is it just tally sticks?
Well, what do you mean in circulation?
Like, are merchants using pounds and shillings, or people using pounds and shillings, and also keeping track of the secondary stack of tally sticks because they know that they owe this many tally sticks, and the king doesn't really care about pounds, but you can exchange a certain number of shillings for a certain number of tally sticks in order to have these two things work for you at the end of the year?
The thing I'm hesitating on is the circulating part. Um, are there coins and tally sticks and just bar tabs recorded in terms of pounds and shillings? Yes. Are people making payments uh, or just purchasing based on their own IOUs, all denominated in pounds and shillings? Yes. Are there shilling coins? Yes. Are there pound coins? No. Are there tally sticks that record pound and shilling values? Yes.
But people aren't exchanging tally sticks.
No, it sounds
with
like
each
they
other.
are. It sounds like they are, because Randy
Yeah,
was
they-
saying that you could exchange it with
Yes.
your neighbor to meet his tax burden at the end of the year.
I
The
see.
king doesn't really care who they come from, right? So you can use a tally stick that somebody else received to pay your taxes.
God, that must have been a nightmare reassembling those
That's
things.
what I was gonna say. Like, before we get to William of Orange, can we talk about how they're assembling these things? Like, does he just...
factories?
They would know which village they went to, I guess. And the exchequer, they would use a checkered tablecloth, put it on the ground, and people would bring in the tally stick, and they would be trying to match them.
My God.
And once they were matched, they were paid, and then they took them back or burned them there. I actually, I'm not sure if they burned them there or took them back. But the exchequer hated the tally sticks. It was a huge amount of work. And so they used them all the way till 1840. And finally, Parliament ended the use of tally sticks. And the exchequer had a whole bunch of their halves of tally sticks left that were stored. And they were so happy they threw them all into the fire at once and burned down Parliament. It's a very famous story and picture, art work that shows Parliament on fire because they burned up all the tally sticks and the fire got out of control.
That's so funny.
My second book, I took a photo of tally sticks that were still used in Sicily until 1919. So they were used until fairly recently. And it wasn't just the king. Feudal lords also could issue tally sticks to within the feudal manor, and people could pay what they owed to the feudal lord with the feudal lord's own tally sticks. Feudal lords also coined their own money, leather coins often, that was used on their own manor.
Oh, Oh, I see. So basically, everybody who is the subject of the Lord would be able to use these tally sticks because they owed him something at the end of the year. Okay, so then let's see if we can connect this to the William of Orange invitation. So you said that the King of England got out of hand, and then Parliament was like, we can't deal with this anymore, and we're going to replace you with William of Orange. What did he do that upset them so much?
Well, he had defaulted on the tally sticks, and people were pretty upset about it. He may well have been very unpopular anyway. I don't know, but it gave this opening for Parliament to take the power of the purse away from the king.
So when you
The
say that
king
he
was
defaulted on the tally sticks, what does that mean?
he refused to accept in tax payment the tally sticks he had issued. So he had received all this stuff from the population using tally sticks, and then he would not let them pay their taxes. And so they were furious, of course.
You said he demanded metal from them instead.
Yes, he wanted metal coins. Um, uh,
He just liked shiny things? He was like a magpie?
well, very likely to pay mercenaries. So if you were fighting for the King of England in France, you would have to provision yourself in France. And you probably weren't even British. So there were reasons why you were not going to just take tally sticks in payment. You wanted coin, and you wanted to be high value gold coins because you've got to spend them in France. And if they're just token coins, in other words, they're metal with hardly any actual gold or silver in them, the danger is that the King of England loses the war, and those coins are going to be worthless, and the tally sticks are worthless. So you want gold in those. So the king needed high value gold coins to pay mercenaries. They didn't have B-57s to carry supplies, so the soldiers had to provision themselves over there.
That makes a lot of sense. And so he basically decides to default. He figures that he's powerful enough to do so without threatening his power, but instead Parliament says, no, we can't have this. And so what do they change? What do they do after they invite William of Orange? Because you said earlier that they put a bunch of rules and regulations on him that the kings hadn't had before.
They gave him a budget, said you can spend this much. And they not long after they set up the Bank of England, and they what happened was you get a merger of private finance and government finance in the Bank of England. So we've been focusing on the crown and so on, but there also are private monies. There's private debt, and there's private production and sale that have nothing to do with the state, nothing to do with the king, the crown, and private banks that are creating money, that are issuing paper money and other kinds of debt. Deposit banking is much more recent. Banking started by issuing paper money, paper notes, and those finance the private part of the economy. They're very separate from state finance. But with the creation of the Bank of England, we get those two financial worlds merged with the Bank of England at the top of the financial system, which is the kind of system we have now. So that one of the consequences of throwing out King Charles and getting control over the crown was that it led to the development of the modern financial system with a central bank at the top of the financial system and somewhat under control. I know we always say the Fed is independent, but it's not true. Somewhat controlled by the legislative body.
Was the parliament not concerned with paying mercenaries? It seems like war seems to be at the center of a lot of this around this time period.
War was, 100-year wars.
Expensive.
And wars were fought by and for gold. So, it's also the time of discovery of America. I told you I just read Columbus's log, and it's pretty amazing because the whole purpose of the trip was gold.
To pay for wars back home, right? To pay for
Columbus
holy
is very
wars.
specific. Columbus is specific. He puts it in the log because he's writing the log for the Spanish crown. I've found all these people. They're going to become good Christians. Okay, we're going to Christianize this population, and they're very docile. He says one of my guys could defeat hundreds of them. They're so naive. They don't even own a knife. And they're so open and welcoming. It'll be so easy to convert them. And they won't put up any significant resistance. But there's a page after he's gone from island to island to island, trying to find the gold. Well, he hasn't found the gold yet, but he's sure that it's there and they're going to find it. And the purpose of the whole trip is to finance another crusade on the Holy Lands. That was the purpose of the trip. They needed money to fund another invasion. They needed gold to fund another invasion. So yes, we have it's the time of wars and trying to get your piece of the Americas, of the New World.
And so my question is, how did the parliament deal with that war debt in a way that was different from the way that Charles had been dealing with it? So obviously they still had the same wars to carry out after he was gone. Did they have a better way of going about that?
The development of the financial system took several hundred years. So there was a major reform with Queen Elizabeth I, which is 1560, if I remember right. And that produced a very hard peg of the pound to first gold, and then later they changed to silver. They kept that for 400 years. That had never happened before. You had never had a metallic standard that didn't get changed. Typically, what had happened in the past is the crown would continually debase the currency, continually, when the coins are received in tax payment, mint them again with less and less precious metal each round. And in addition to reducing the quantity of gold, they would simply announce a new value for the coins. So a coin that used to be worth £1, it would take 2 coins now to make £1. That's called crying down the currency. The population would accept it up to a point. It was only when the king got completely out of hand, like refusing to accept his own IOUs, that the population rose up. They accepted it as being, sort of normal behavior of the sovereign to cry down the value of the coins and force me to deliver more to pay my taxes. It's sort of like the way we accept our government deciding to raise our taxes on us. That's how they accepted it.
Or gas prices, I think, is like the most obvious one to me. Like sometimes gas just costs twice as much as usual, and people are just like, all right, to a point, I suppose. But that seems like it would only work locally. Like that's not going to work for hiring mercenaries.
Um, the mercenaries,
I guess you could offer them other things. Like I know, like I said earlier, the Romans were offering their mercenaries the chance to become citizens. You could give people farms, plots of lands. You could offer them tax breaks in the future. You could offer them, I don't know, any kind of favors in judicial proceedings. Like they get a break the next time someone sues them or something like that.
Yeah, because like if your coins don't have any gold in them, they're just as valuable as tally sticks are in France. Like France doesn't want
they're,
those coins.
they're the equivalent of tally sticks. That's right. And that's the way most money has been through most of the history of money. People call that a fiat money. I don't like the term because it's saying I am by fiat because I'm your king. I'm telling you what this will be worth. Um, but no intrinsic value is the way most money was. Private banknotes that were issued by the private banks were all that kind of money. Okay, there's nothing unusual about this. That the chalkboard at the pub, is just chalk, right? There's no intrinsic value to that. It's an IOU, and I recorded it. That's the way most money has always been. It's just a record. The record itself has no value. It's the debt that has value. But in the case of the mercenaries, yes, they don't really want the king's debt. I don't know about England offering citizenship. Not sure they even had the notion of citizenship. Um, but what the kings would do is default on debts to banks. The Italian banks were major funders of the crowns of Europe, including the English.
Hmm.
And those crowns would often default on the debts. Why would the banks do it? Because they got special privileges. So that's more like what you're talking about. So, yes, okay, we lost on that loan to the king, but the king is giving us this instead. Okay. So they could be compensated some other way.
Interesting. So,
By the way, are people at this point in time using coins as exchange amongst each other, or are they still giving, sheep and paying one another with bushels of grain, things like that? To what extent is the population? Because at this, in modern times, obviously we don't really trade much like in that primary way. Was that still prevalent?
around the time where King Charles was deposed, or
Yeah, just like when the coins become more prominent.
The majority of your transactions would be in your own IOU. Okay. But you have to eventually pay up. And then it could be a coin, it could be a private banknote. Um, it could be you pay in kind. I think all of those things are probably true. The part the we are used to a completely monetized economy, right? Even now, nobody in my neighborhood mows their own lawn. You know, even lawn mowing has become completely monetized. Um, that wasn't true back then. Coins were so valuable that uh, average low income people uh, are not going to come across those very often. Um, Coins didn't seem to circulate very much. The reason we know that is because we find these caches of coins. Someone buried them in their basement and forgot. They died and no one knew. And so there have been these cases where they uncover a huge quantity of coins and they look at them, gold is a very soft metal, so it wears out very fast. That's one of the disadvantages of putting it into coins. But it turns out most of the coins they found are not very worn, which tells you they did not circulate very much. I think coins are supposed to lose a percent of their weight every year, something like that.
Wow.
So they don't circulate very much. And you could find a collection that had coins that varied greatly in age. They can tell by the design of the coin when it probably was minted, because they didn't have years stamped on them. Also, people don't know until recently, coins did not have a value stamped on them. They were worth whatever the crown said they were worth, which is why it was easy to change the value. Say, oh, that one that has that picture on it, that now is only worth half as much. But anyway, the evidence is they did not circulate very much. So they did not pass through a lot of hands.
It just seems like a really difficult thing to circulate, right? Because we talked about the counterfeiting as a problem. And then also, if the coins are losing some of their weight and people already know, then what you're really trying to do is trying to figure out some standard of weights and measures by which you can put these things on a scale and figure out.
You'd definitely be in your best interest to get rid of all your coins at the end of the year.
In what sense?
Well, it might not be worth that much next year.
Oh, yeah, because I was thinking about the tallies at the alewives. If the coin is being continuously debased, then the tally marks that were made a year ago, 2 years from now, won't, if the debt is paid, won't get the alewife the same amount of stuff that she needs to be able to make the next batch of beer or whatever.
The tally sticks won't go down. So that's an advantage.
I see.
Because those are marked in terms of the pounds and shillings they're worth. Now,
But if the pound and shilling is worth
it's a different
less.
matter.
But if the pound and shilling is worth less, then the tally stick is kind of by proxy also worth less, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the pound is a measuring unit. It doesn't go down. It's a pound. A pound is a pound. A shilling is a shilling. Now, the number of shillings in a pound, I think, did change over time. So you could change that.
But the coin might be worth less pounds or less shillings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so we have all of these different systems in place. Clearly, there is at some point a necessity for gold because you have all of these empires or kingdoms and they're trying to war with each other and conquer one another, and you need this thing that everybody wants.
And wars seem to be primarily determined by how big your army is. That's what's really crazy.
Yeah.
Right? So if you can hire people, you don't have enough, you use up all of your own people pretty quickly.
Yeah.
In these ridiculous battles, and then you need to find new soldiers, and the only way to compel them is with something that they can exchange locally.
And for whatever reason, people love gold. And so
it's rare. You can't just manifest it. It doesn't tarnish. You can reuse it. You can melt it down. I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think they were using this electrum stuff too, quite a bit too, from what I read.
That was Greece. It was a natural mixture of gold and silver. So those are the earliest coins that we know of.
So we have the parliament stepping in to say at this critical juncture that we can't have a king who's going to default on his debts because that causes too many problems for us. The people are too unhappy. It causes too much of a fracture in society. And so they invite William of Orange, they give him a budget, and then you say that from this point, central banks emerge. And I feel like central banking is something that we wanted to talk about at the beginning of this conversation because it's so foundational to the way that we live today. And I think that it's a confusing system. And so maybe understanding what it did at the beginning would help.
I do want to come back and talk about war some more too, eventually. That's fine. We can do central banking because that's a really confusing situation.
Okay.
But war still seems to be at the heart of everything that happens in the world, and I'm very interested. It seems like people make a lot of money off of war, though, these days, and I don't know if that was the case. Anyways, we can come back to that.
Okay. I'll hit it.
Okay, so King Charles, he defaults, I think it's 1672, if I remember right. And they bring in William of Orange at the 1689, 1690, something like that. And they create the Bank of England in 1694. This is the second central bank created in the world. The first one was in Sweden. And they do several things that lead it to become the central bank. So first, they Parliament issues debt that the Bank of England buys. And that debt becomes sort of the base of the central bank's capital or equity. It's the debt of the government. And the Bank of England is allowed to issue paper money against that debt.
How do they set that
And
quantity initially?
I don't know the numbers. I mean, compared to today's, it would sound small.
But is it a bottomless pit? I mean, like, how much debt does the government decide that it can issue?
Parliament decided. So that's a key. It's not the king. Parliament decides. So it's democratically decided. We're going to issue this much debt. Bank of England will hold that against paper money that it issues. They give the Bank of England several special privileges that other banks don't have. And what that leads to is the Bank of England's notes become the preferred notes. One of the things they did was they allowed them to issue pretty low denomination notes so that they could circulate more widely. So if you were a bank and you could only issue a 20-pound note, most people could never use it because it's far too valuable. So they gave them special privileges like that. They also they had different rules for the minimum number of stockholders in the banks. So in every way they could, they favored the Bank of England. And what that did is it made the Bank of England the strongest bank operating in London. And of course, London is the really important place for finance. You have country banks. And what country banks used to do before Bank of England was they all issued banknotes, so they're all creating money. And the country banks would make their notes convertible to London bank notes to give them value. Now, by making them convertible into London notes, they're valuable, but they're not going to be converted very often because you have to get to London to do the conversion, right? But it gives you some confidence in them. Say, well, if I ever really needed to, I could convert them in London and get these bigger banks notes. Well, Bank of England starts displacing those. So it becomes the preferred note to make your own notes convertible into, and Bank of England notes start circulating all over the country. And again, lower denominations, so they're more likely to be used in smaller transactions. So the Bank of England starts to become what we call the Reserve Bank. It is the one that everybody is converting their notes into. And so they want to hold some of those notes at their own bank to do the conversions, making it easier to convert, which makes their notes acceptable. And eventually, I'm going through 400 years. In the 19th century, the Bank of England discovered how it could stop bank runs. So bank runs were always the danger. I'm a little bank out in the country. I've issued a bunch of notes. People start to worry that I might default on my promise to convert to either London banknotes or Bank of England notes. And so I get a run on my bank. Everybody's bringing the notes in saying, I don't want to hold these anymore. I want better quality notes. And what the Bank of England did before the middle of the 19th century was what every other bank did, which was to uh, do the same thing. So if I'm holding, if I receive some other bank's notes in payment of loans, I will immediately go to that bank and say, I want Bank of England notes. And then the Bank of England would do the same thing. So rather than doing conversions, you don't do conversions. I mean, you don't supply uh, the more desirable notes on demand. You try to call in your own notes in a way and not do the conversions. But the Bank of England discovered that that only causes the run to spread from bank to bank to bank. Because if one bank has a run, then you start to worry about your bank, you run to it, and so on. The Bank of England discovered that if it supplied notes to any bank that had a run, it could stop the run. We call that lender of last resort. And so by the middle of the 19th century, the Bank of England starts to perform this second really important central banking function. The first one is to be the reserve bank. The second one is to be a lender of last resort. So the central bank becomes lender of last resort. So now I've gone through very quickly the three main functions of central banks. The first was to lend to the government, accept the government's IOUs. The second is to be the reserve into which other banks promise to convert their own notes. And then the third is if there are runs, you stop them by lending your notes to those banks so they can make the conversion and you can stop the run.
I'm
So
still
you
a
get
little,
all
I'm still
three
a
of
tiny
those
bit
things.
confused about the foundation of that, like the original
The
debt.
issuance of debt.
Yeah, it's like it just I don't understand how that has intrinsic value. This issue, like how you quantify what what you can actually pay for as a government. Like what does that represent? Does it represent labor? Is it fixed? Is that debt somehow correspond to particular goods and services?
Maybe we could start with like when you say that Parliament issues the debt to the central bank to kickstart this whole thing, what does the central bank actually have in hand at the end of the day?
A government bond,
And what does the bond represent?
the government's debt.
So this feels circular.
I mean, this is the same problem I have trying to understand the creation of money today too. This is why it's so central, right? Because what is it actually good for at the end of the day? It's good for a promise from the government that it'll be worth something later, but
And
worth what exactly?
Is this connected to taxation? Because we still have this idea that the government is getting people to do stuff. And so the idea is that it gives the bond to the banks, while on the other hand, also powering the ability of the people to actually do work and provide value through taxation.
Yes. So the
This is the place where I feel absolutely stupidest about economics.
Well, I've heard some MMT people talking about how taxation is at the heart of money, essentially. That this is Warren Mosler's whole thing, right? That you don't yeah.
There is a slogan used by MMT. It's a simplification, but it focuses you in on something that's fundamental, which is that a sovereign government can impose a liability on you. Today, it's mostly taxes. In these times, we're talking about most of the liabilities were fines and fees, and then taxes too. But most people are probably going to owe some fines and fees. So you know the story of Robin Hood, and they make it about the evil king who is fining them. If you shoot a deer, you owe the king, because in principle, all the deer are the king's deer.
We still have that one
You
around
chop
here.
what?
We still have that one around here in our parts.
Okay.
Yeah.
You chop down a tree for firewood, you owe a fine because all the trees are the king's. And so you accumulate all these fines, and you have to pay the fines. So how are you going to pay them? Well, you get hold of the king's own debts, the tally sticks, or the coins, or the paper notes. That's how you pay your fine. If you don't pay the fine, you go to prison, and they hold you, and your family has to pay the fine to get you out of prison. Prisons were not for punishment. Prisons were holding you hostage until that fine gets paid. Um, so, that's why you will work hard to try to get the tally stick or whatever it is you can use to pay the fine so that you don't go to prison. So we say taxes drive the demand for the king's money, because that's how you're going to get out of debt.
So at the bottom of this pyramid is labor, essentially, or like natural resources, something like that.
Yeah, whatever you can sell to get the king's tokens. You don't have to sell them to the king. If you can find some buyer that has the king's tokens, then you can get what you need to pay the tax.
And he's taking some of that debt liability and handing it over to the central bank, essentially.
Well, once they create the central bank, the central bank can hold the parliament's liability and issue notes Parliament can spend. And then
Interesting.
Parliament can get you to accept those notes by imposing a tax on you.
And so that first transaction between the Parliament and the bank, where you're saying that it's taking Parliament's liability, is the reason that this is so hard to understand because the liability is kind of pre-existing and already in place by the time that the bank is created? Because it's not like it's a de novo system where they're like, all right, we're going to wipe the slate clean and create liabilities out of nowhere and then assign these brand new liabilities to the bank. It seems like all of these things are already in play and they're kind of transferring this liability that they already have and saying, okay, we're not navigating this liability. What we're going to do is we're going to give it to the bank, and the bank is going to create the medium of exchange, which will then go out into the population. And because people are using this medium of exchange, it seems almost like a tally stick.
But it's aggregated. It's aggregated. I think that's the real value of it, is they can aggregate it in order to give large loans and finance big projects that are very expensive.
Yeah, like you don't need a wagon of tally sticks anymore. You have a note and it represents many tallies. Like, is that a linear relationship like that, or am I oversimplifying it?
See, remember I said the kings were already used to borrowing. They would borrow from Italian banks. And so what does borrowing mean? They issue a debt that's held by an Italian bank. The king is promising to make payments, including interest, to the Italian bank.
In gold?
And then what?
In gold?
No. It could be in even in tally sticks, but probably it's going to be in coins, and probably they're going to have some precious metal in them. So anyway, the only difference is that now, instead of Italian banks providing the finance, which could be paper notes, it's going to be the Bank of England, Parliament's own bank that they created, is going to be the one issuing the paper notes that Parliament uses to finance its spending. And then they also cover some of the Crown's expenses. They gave him a budget. You can spend this much.
I think we should take a break. Hey guys, real quick interruption. I need to ask you a quick favor. Remember, podcast is entirely supported by listeners. That means that we don't have to sell you anything. We're not participating in any other economy than the production of this show, and you're supporting it directly. So come over and check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/demystifysci. You can join our group. We get together once a week and hang out, and I would love to see you there. So check it out, patreon.com/demystifysci, and enjoy the rest of the conversation.
When we took this break, Shiloh and I were talking, and I think that I understand a little bit more, and I want to give you the model that I have in my mind and have you tell me just how wrong it is. And so you have Parliament issuing debt to a central bank, and the central bank issuing currency that is informed by the amount of debt that they carry in their vaults in the form of government bonds. That currency is issued to people who then do stuff, produce things, mine things. They serve as the basis for a material-based economy that requires labor to create things of value. So they create things of value. And then at the end of the year, the king is like, I need stuff back from you in the form of taxes, fees, and fines. And so the people that have created value snip off some portion of the value, they give it to the king, and then the king uses what he gives them to pay his debts to the Bank of Italy or whatever other external source he owes money to. Or is it, I feel that's the part where I'm fuzziest on.
Right. So Parliament is in debt, and Parliament is going to make payments on the debt held by the Bank of England. The Bank of England has essentially monetized the debt of the government by issuing paper notes.
Who is Parliament in debt
denominated
to?
Parliament's in debt.
To whom? Who do they owe their debt to?
The Bank of England has bought the bonds.
I don't understand. Like, this is such, for some reason, this my mind slips off of this concept like oil on water. I'm not like, how does Parliament? Why is Parliament in?
I honestly see it like this. Like, it seems to me like the government, Parliament, has essentially handed over some portion of their natural resources and labor of their country people to, in the form of this debt, to the central bank. And the central bank is sitting on that. And they're entitled essentially to that labor. And I mean, at the bottom of this pyramid is this tax burden, which is essentially labor and natural resources and just activity that's being done.
How does Parliament know how much debt it has?
Okay, let's back up. Okay, in the United States today, the U.S. Treasury issues bonds. Okay, and those can be bought by the public, including you. You can have an account at treasurydirect.gov. And you can just type in and buy a $5,000 5-year bond. Okay. So that's your asset. It's the Treasury's debt. The Treasury is promising to make interest payments to you. Okay. The Fed also can buy that debt. And then the Treasury makes interest payments to the Fed instead of to you. So when the Bank of England was founded, Parliament sold debt to the Bank of England and promises to make payments to Parliament. sorry, to Bank of England. Okay.
What does
And
that bond represent, though? Like you say, it represents the debt, but like, how do you decide how much debt you have? Are you basing it on something? Are you basing it on
well, the initial act, I don't know the number, but it's let's say a couple £100,000. Parliament decided how much debt to issue, and that will then determine how many banknotes the Bank of England is initially going to issue.
And does that the amount that they decide to issue, the £100,000, is that informed by
How much they're taking
how
in
much
taxes, as far as I can tell.
That's what I'm trying to understand. Is it how much they're taking in from taxes prior to the establishment of the bank? Is it how much gold they have in their vaults? Is it how much money they owe to somebody else? Like where?
No.
Or is it to them?
So it should be related to Parliament's planned spending. What is their need? And then they're going to be servicing that debt. And so you might think that it's going to be related to the taxes they expect they'll be able to receive. Because what those taxes will do is take those notes back out of the economy. Just like the tally sticks used to return to the king and get burned, the tax will take the notes out of the economy. Okay? Now, is it absolutely necessary for them to take every note? Well, no, not really. If they take every note, then we would say, well, that's a balanced budget. If they leave some of the notes in, we would say, oh, that was a deficit. If they take more out than they put in, we would call that a surplus. Governments typically run deficits, and there's nothing new about this at all. The government of England typically would have spent more than they took in taxes. But what the taxes do is it pulls notes out of the economy, and then they can be burned or shredded or reused. Any of those is possible. Reuse them if they're still in good shape. Otherwise, burn them, shred them.
So, okay, if the Parliament looks at what they need for the next year, or for the next 5 years or 10 years, and they basically say, this is how much debt we have to accrue in order to produce these goods and services. And so they give that amount of debt to the banks, and they charge the banks with distributing notes in the population, which will be used to achieve those goods and services, which were then set out by Parliament. Is that a fair?
It will be Parliament doing the spending, putting those notes into the economy.
Because they get the notes in return for selling the bonds.
Yes.
Okay, so why the burning of the notes? Why doesn't it just perpetually circulate?
So you've got a recipe, you're making a cake, and you find that you're out of sugar. So you go to your neighbor and say, hey, can I borrow 2 cups of sugar? And you write, I owe you 5 cups of sugar. And you give it to your neighbor. So you both remember. Okay. A couple weeks later, you've gone to the store and you come back, 2 cups of sugar. And your neighbor gives you back the IOU. Okay, because you paid. What are you going to do with the IOU?
If you're a very efficient person, you would have a filing cabinet full of IOUs for every condition so that the next time you need to borrow a cup of sugar, you can just pull the same one without having to redo it, right?
Okay. So you would save a little bit of paper if you stored it. Or you could do what most people would do, which is tear it up and recycle it. Either one.
But that seems wasteful on large scales, right? Because it's like, right? Because I mean, I think in the sample of the one IOU, it makes perfect sense because I mean, what is one piece of paper? But if we're talking about millions of pieces of paper, what's the benefit? Like, it just seems like it seems like a money pit to collect the pieces of paper and be like, well, that's done, and then burn it, and then go to the next room and then just print all the pieces of paper again. That seems crazy.
So the Fed will hold paper dollars that come into the Fed, up to some point. And then after that, they shred them. And first, they're going to shred the ones that are most worn out. If you take a tour of the Fed, at the end of the tour, you get a little baggie of shredded notes. The point is, once they come back to the Bank of England or the Fed, they are no longer money. They are pieces of paper. And whether they store them or not depends on how efficient is it to store them over just printing them up again later. Okay? They are not money anymore. Your IOU, when it comes back to you, is no longer valuable except as a piece of paper.
And
This
so,
is called redemption. So IOUs have to be redeemed. If you get a pizza coupon, a new pizza joint opens up, they mail out free pizza coupons, and you go in with your coupon. What are you doing? You're going to redeem it for a pizza. You get a pizza. The pizza joint redeems their debt. They no longer have a debt. They get the coupon back. Are they going to put it in the cash drawer of their cash register and say, oh, I received money. It's worth a pizza. Or are they going to throw it away, toss it in the pizza oven? They're going to toss it in the oven. It's no longer valuable. It's their IOU. They redeemed themselves. They got out of debt. Their debt was they owed you a pizza. They gave you the pizza.
okay.
There's no longer a debt.
So that makes sense in terms of the pizza parlor or you with your next door neighbor because the exchange that's happening is really small and contained. There's a coupon that you got in the mail, you come in, you give the pizza place the coupon, and the pizza place throws the coupon away because the exchange is done, they've gotten you into the store, you've probably bought more than the coupon is worth, and so they've accomplished their goal of getting you through the door to buy the sodas and the breadsticks and maybe 3 pizzas instead of just 1 pizza because you decided to throw a party because it's cheaper, like whatever, there's incentives. And they can throw the coupon away because the transaction is finished. But when it comes to governments, it then feels like there's this extra step where the governments now owe stuff to each other. And because if you're buying something from France or China, or you're spending money in France or China as a government, then the IOU, which is the money as it comes back to you, is it just that you're not paying in the bills themselves when you go abroad as a government? Is it because you're selling government bonds to pay for things? Like, why don't you need those coupons, which represent actual labor and value and is the global reserve currency, to then pay somebody else? Because everybody accepts dollars. If you want something from...
If it's a foreign government's IOU, you don't burn it. If it's your IOU, you burn it.
I see.
Your IOU is not valuable to you.
But if that person paid you, so let's say that the person comes in to pay for a pizza and they don't pay for the pizza with a coupon, they pay it with dollars. You burn the coupon, but you don't burn the dollars because the dollars are the foreign currency in this sense.
There's someone else's IOU. Someone else's IOU can be valuable to you. Your own IOU can't be valuable. If it was, you could become a millionaire right now. Right, I owe me $1 million. Okay, I'm a millionaire.
That makes sense.
why not get your people to fulfill their IOUs in some kind of currency that is valuable to you so you don't burn it at the end of the day, but you can actually do something with it? Is that a crazy?
Well, the King of England or the U.S. government might like to have you pay your taxes with French coins. The United States accepted foreign currency in tax payment till I think the 1840s. So they might like that. But generally, it's hard for Americans to get French coins.
Rating.
We
Has to
don't
do
do
some
it
rating or
anymore.
something. Yeah.
The U.S. government won't take it.
Mm-hmm.
Try to pay your taxes with French coins. They're not going to take them anymore. But they did back then. Are they glad? Is the U.S. government glad to have foreign currency flowing in? Yes, they are. They can use it to help manage exchange rates, which is a whole different issue. But today, when you pay your taxes, all of the tax revenue is burned. All of it. Government doesn't save any of it. It's all burned. Because today it is all electronic entries.
Now, and Warren Mosler makes the case that it's not even the same pool of entries that's used to pay things in the future. In other words, that the tax burden isn't actually what they're using to pay for processes at a later point, which departs from this system that we've been talking about so far.
Well, you can't use your grandchildren's income. You can't transfer. The claim always is that because our government today is spending more than it takes in and issuing government bond debt, we are burdening our grandchildren. Cannot be true. Our grandchildren will decide what their tax rate is going to be, and they will pay that tax rate regardless of what the bonds are. We're not going. They could decide to burden themselves. They could say, "Hey, there's right now it's 32 trillion. Let's say by the time your kids are adults or your grandkids are adults, it's 50 trillion." They could impose taxes high enough to retire all that debt. Okay. But that's their choice. It has nothing to do with us. It would be a stupid policy and almost certainly not successful. Because if they put that kind of a tax burden on the economy, they would completely destroy the economy. So they're not actually going to be able to do it. But they could try to do it, but it's their choice.
But this is where we enter into this grand fiction and this faith in the monetary system where it doesn't actually represent, the money in the central bank doesn't at some point actually represent this tax burden. It represents some fictitious amount that is decided year to year.
Every year, Congress will have a budget. Tax policy isn't changed every year, but you potentially they could. They could say every year we're going to start all over again and rewrite the whole tax code. In practice, they don't do that. Tax changes are relatively rare. So the tax revenue will change every year without any change in the tax code, just because we have income tax, we have a sales tax. It depends on what the income is, depends on what the sales are to determine what the revenue will be. But they don't change tax law very often. But spending law changes every year. Every year they come up with a different budget, and they have to make compromises and determine what the new budget will be. But yeah, that's decided every year. We can't decide the budget for 30 years from now. Our grandkids will decide what the budget's going to be. They will decide what the tax law is. They are going to inherit a lot of government bonds. What are those bonds? Those bonds are not debts of our grandkids. They're debts of Uncle Sam. They are assets for the grandkids. The grandkids are going to inherit $50 trillion of wealth when we all die.
Let's unpack that a little bit, because the debt that the government has issued is issued in the form of bonds. The central bank prints money and exchanges that money for the bonds that are sold to it by the government. Correct so far?
Well, we'd better start at the beginning.
Okay.
How does the government really spend? Now, in the early days with the Bank of England, the spending really did take the form of banknotes. Okay, so that's how the notes got into the economy. Today, modern governments don't spend that way, but it does run through the central bank. So that Bank of England setup led to the development of the modern monetary system, where it is the central bank that makes all the payments for the Treasury. So the Fed makes all payments for the US Treasury. Congress decides what the Treasury is going to be allowed to spend. So that's what the budget does. Congress passes a budget that allows the Treasury to spend on each one of the programs, and they all have different allotments of money. The Treasury can spend up to that amount. But the Treasury actually doesn't do the spending. All the spending is done by the Fed. So in the old days, I don't mean 200 years ago, I mean before modern digital everything, the way the Treasury spent was it would mail out checks. So on the first of the month, all the Social Security retirees get their paycheck, Social Security payment. They take it to the bank, their bank, a private bank. The private bank sends that to the Fed. The Fed credits the private bank's reserves. Bank reserves are just a deposit account that every bank has at the central bank. So Bank of America, Crocker Bank, Chase Manhattan Bank, whatever bank it is, has an account at the Fed. When the Fed receives that check, they credit that bank's reserves.
And
Check
this
cleared.
ties back to the Central Bank of England, where one of the ways that they stopped runs was by saying that we'll pay anything that people come to demand of you. And so they keep track of that in order to prevent runs, because they'll insure the deposits.
And I'll get to that. The Fed still does that. So now your bank will credit your deposit account because the Treasury's check cleared. Okay. The Fed accepted it, said, yeah, this is a legitimate check of the Treasury. So we credit your bank's reserves and your bank credits your demand deposit. That's how all government spending takes place, except now it's all digital. So you get a digital payment and it's much quicker. There's no delay. Your bank account will be credited and your bank's reserves are credited. That's how the Treasury spends. When April 15th comes around, you pay your tax. What do? In the old days, you wrote a check, you mailed it to the IRS. IRS receives it, sends it to the Fed. The Fed debits your bank's reserves, and your bank debits your account. That's how the payment was made. Today, it's all digital. So you electronically file, your bank account is debited electronically, and your bank's reserves are debited. So government spending puts reserves into the banks. Government taxes take the reserves out of the banks. That's how it happens.
And
That's how spending takes place.
the Fed, when they get that tax payment, just deletes the entry completely from their books. That's the equivalent of burning.
Bank reserves go down.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, there's one more balance sheet operation, which is when the Fed credits your bank's reserves, making a payment for the Treasury, the Fed debits the Treasury's account at the central bank. So the Treasury has an account at the central bank, and its account gets debited whenever a payment is made. Its account gets credited whenever taxes are received. So there are 4 accounts there: yours, your bank, the Fed, and the Treasury are all involved in every dollar spent by the Treasury, every dollar received by the Treasury, and now it's almost all digital. I used to always say you can't even pay your taxes anymore with dollar bills or coins, but actually it turns out there is one nut who does, who takes a wheelbarrow and goes to the IRS and pays taxes with coins. And he was interviewed, why do you do that? He said, because I want to make sure at least one person at the IRS has a bad day.
I get
You
them.
could do it, but no one does it that way anymore. And this is why people cannot understand how the government spends. In the old days, it was really obvious. Oh, the Treasury spends paper money, okay, and then they receive it back. But now we've got 2 degrees of separation between you and the Treasury. We have your bank and we have the central bank involved. So it's no longer obvious how it happens. So now the question will be, well, hold it. What if the Treasury orders the Fed to make a payment, but the Treasury's account is 0?
I actually have that question written down as the next
That's what I was
question
going to
gonna
ask too.
I always know that
You've done this
question will
before.
come up. Okay. And the answer is it's complicated. But and it changes over time. So the Fed and Treasury, knew obviously this is a possibility. This is going to happen. And we didn't create our central bank till 1913. So Bank of England, 1694. We don't have a central bank until 1913 because Americans don't trust big banks, especially Americans who don't live in New York City. Yeah. So anyway, we got ours in 1913. And Congress still didn't really trust big banks and didn't trust the big government either. So we had a very small government. We were an anti-government country, anti-big bank country. But we had a severe financial crisis in 1907. And the J.P. Morgan called in the presidents of all the big New York banks, got him into his room, and had the guards lock the door and said, none of you is leaving until you all agree. Put in enough money to save the US financial system. And then they said, and we don't want to ever have to do this again because there was a bank run and we had no central bank. So the big banks had to be the suppliers of reserve currency. So anyway, then there was a push to create a central bank. So we created one, but Congress really didn't trust them. And so they put constraints on the Fed. And they said that the Fed could not lend to the Treasury. The Fed could not buy Treasury bonds. And so the Treasury would have to borrow from the public, not from its own central bank. The Fed could only make payments for the Treasury if the Treasury had a positive balance in its account. And the Treasury could not sell bonds to the Fed, because if the Treasury could sell bonds to the Fed, which is essentially what Parliament did, it could always get money into its account. Okay? But our Fed could not do what the Bank of England could do. So they thought they had a foolproof system. to prevent the government from borrowing or issuing debt to the Fed. But the Fed and Treasury worked out ways to get around it. And the ways that they do it have changed over time. But the main way that they do it is that the Treasury will sell bonds to private banks. And we have a couple of layers of these. We have what are called, we created a system of dealer banks. So somewhere around 20 banks that deal in government bonds. So what a dealer will do is they buy them, but they plan to then sell them. They're going to place them into the private markets. The dealer banks must offer to buy them. So they all submit a price at which they're willing to buy, and they have to be reasonable prices. They can't say, oh, I'll buy a $100 bond for 50 cents. No, it has to be a reasonable price. Okay? In order to keep that status, and they want to keep the status because this is their business. They make money on this, right? So they buy at a slightly cheaper price than they sell. That's how they make money. So they want to be able to do it. So that's the first line. The second line is we have a bunch of banks, I think over 1,000, that are special depositories that have what are called tax and loan accounts. And these were designed to help smooth out bank reserves over the course of the year. I'm getting into a little more detail than we need to explain it. Every time the government spends, it puts reserves into the system. Every time the government taxes, it takes reserves out of the system. And if you think about it, taxes come on quarterly due dates, 4 times a year, plus April 15. Huge volumes of tax payments. The government is taking huge volumes of reserves out of the banks, and they're going to run short. They're going to run out. On the other hand, spending is spread out over the course of the year, although around the first of the month, a lot of checks go out. So at least 12 times a year, huge volumes of reserves are going in. So you have these huge fluctuations of bank reserves, which have to be managed. Because otherwise, banks are either going to be really short of reserves or have way too many reserves. And the impact of that is on the interest rates. So the interest rates, whenever the banks have a lot of reserves, the interest rates would collapse towards zero. When banks are short, they all will be trying to borrow reserves and pushing interest rates up. So to prevent that so-called reserve effect, these tax and loan account banks were able to accept deposits when the Treasury received tax revenue, so that the reserves don't leave the banking system. So you don't immediately take the reserves out and credit the Treasury's account at the Fed. What you do is you credit the Treasury's account at 1,000 banks spread all over the country, so they didn't lose reserves. And when the Treasury sells bonds, these banks can buy bonds without losing any reserves. That's why it's called and loan account, because it's like they are giving a loan to the Treasury. So that won't impact reserves. So that's the second line of defense. The Treasury can always sell bonds to these tax and loan account banks that effectively are buying bonds without paying for them.
Are these banks
They
that
don't
people
lose them.
interact with, or are they banks that are isolated from consumers?
No, these are normal banks, and they're spread all over the country. They just have a special status that where they are effectively able to buy bonds without paying for them for a while, and able to accept Treasury deposits. Okay? The whole purpose of this is just to smooth out reserves in the banking system so that Treasury operations don't affect the banking system. And then the final backup is the Treasury can sell bonds to normal banks or to you. And they can sell them in advance of their spending and get a credit to their account. So every morning, the Fed and Treasury talk on the phone. And they have projections of, well, how many taxes are going to be paid today? What's your estimate? How many government checks will be cashed today? And that will give us an idea of the flows into and out of the Treasury's account at the Fed. They make a prediction. And then the Treasury will decide, oh, we're going to be short. We better sell some bonds in order to top up our account at the Fed. So they coordinate the operations and make sure the Treasury has a positive account, at least by the end of the day, where almost certainly the Treasury does run overdrafts. But by the end of the day, they try to make up for them by selling enough bonds.
And is there ever a
So-
situation where people won't buy the bonds
Nope.
because these first dealer banks are obligated to purchase? And are they obligated to purchase? So is there some kind of floating point where if, let's say, people aren't buying bonds on the stock market, that the dealer banks are required to purchase all of the bonds that are being sold?
So the Treasury is, running these markets regularly. They do talk to the dealer banks and ask them, what maturities are you thinking you're going to be liking, so that we offer maturities that the market wants. Maybe the market wants 30-year bonds. They don't want 5-year bonds. So they're coordinating to make sure that what they offer is in line with what the market wants. Sometimes does the Treasury offer 5-year bonds and it turns out the market really didn't want them? Yeah, that happens. They can come back the next day with it, or next week with a different offer. So they're not trying, to match it dollar for dollar every day. Just make sure there's always some extra in the Treasury's account. And the Treasury's been running quite a bit extra in recent years. So there's not much danger they're going to run an overdraft.
So with the dealer banks, are the dealer banks also banks that consumers are banking at, or is it just is it a special type of bank that is just between banks and the government, or is it a type of bank where it also carries consumer accounts and is just classified as a dealer bank because it's one of the small number of banks that's authorized for this mandatory exchange of bonds for balances?
I think that the composition used to be that many or most of them were special. Now it's just the big banks. The big name banks that you know of have dealer operations. So I don't know if they applied and got it, or they bought the dealer banks and brought them in. But now I think the majority are the big banks.
Got it.
Which is somewhat controversial because this is a lucrative business.
I bet.
So if this mismatch between the in and the out isn't really a big problem because you're really just putting that wealth onto the future, why are the politicians always screaming about the mismatch and the deficit and all of these things?
So this goes back to the very first question. Why do you need to know something about money? Because the politicians are lying to you. They are lying.
Because fear is a great motivator? Or?
Well, look, if we go back to the end of World War II. Virtually everything that MMT claims was common knowledge. Government cannot run out of its own money. Everyone knew that. Okay, the question is not whether the government can find the money. The question was whether you can find the resources so that the government can buy them without causing inflation. So think about World War II. The US government before Roosevelt was about 3% of the economy. Tiny. We had a very tiny government. It was ramped up because of the Great Depression with New Deal programs, so it got bigger. But then World War II, that was the big change. Government goes to 50% of the economy. The government is buying 50% of the output. Okay? In our previous wars, we always got inflation, high inflation. Civil War is famous, especially the Confederacy. Massive inflation. Okay? Because you're buying up all the output. And in the case of the Confederate States, they didn't want to raise taxes because they said, look, our population is suffering enough fighting this war. We can't also impose taxes on them. In my first, my 1998 book, I go through with quotes from the people running the government. This was their justification. And so low taxes, high government spending, and taking, probably in the case of the Confederates, more than half of all the output, they got massive inflation. So anyway, Britain in World War I got high inflation. For us, World War I wasn't as big of a deal. We weren't fighting at home, right? So anyway, John Maynard Keynes was involved in war planning, helping the Treasury. 1930, knowing that war is coming, he wrote a pamphlet called How to Pay for the War. And he laid out what you do to prevent inflation so it doesn't happen again. What you have to do is reduce private consumption. Okay? So one thing you want to do is raise taxes. Do you need taxes for revenue? No. You need taxes so that people don't buy stuff.
Because you need to be able to make that stuff available to the government for its war effort.
Right. So who do you tax? You know, taxing the rich is going to be popular, but it doesn't help. You got to tax everybody who's going to consume. Okay, that's one thing. You postpone consumption. So you say, look, you're not going to get any wage increases during the war. Even though we're going to be at full employment and beyond, no wage increases. You can have wage increases after the war. Okay, or we will reward you with something. In the case of the United States, in World War II, we promised pensions and health care. Okay, so that was the trade-off. You can use rationing. Keynes was against, he wanted to minimize rationing because it would cause shortages. If you ration and use wage and price controls, he was afraid that those wouldn't be sufficient. You can use patriotic saving. So you have a campaign to convince people that they should contribute to the war effort by not spending. And if you watch the MMT documentary that's streaming now, there's a long section on this, which actually gets the TV advertisements from World War II in the United States, where they made it clear. It says, keep that money in your wallet. Be patriotic. Don't buy. We need it for the war effort. So anyway, all of these things were used, and everyone understood it wasn't that the government needed your money. What the government needed was the resources. So that's how you go about preventing inflation in war. So people understood this. When after the war ended, the guy who had been the chairman of the New York Bank, which is the most important bank, although chairman sounds like the most important person, the president is the more important person. But anyway, he gave speeches arguing that taxes for revenue purposes are obsolete. Government doesn't need taxes for revenue. He said, the war has taught the government and the war has taught the people that we don't need taxes for revenue. Government can't run out of its own money. The taxes serve other purposes. He goes through 4 other purposes in addition to reducing consumption. You can use them to try to reduce inequality. You can use them to punish bad behavior, so we tax cigarettes. You can use them to allocate resources. So you tax truckers who use the highways, not because you need their revenue, but because we want to allocate the cost of highways to the truckers that are using the highways, right? So anyway, you can think of reasons why you want taxes, but you don't need them for revenue. This was well understood. What happened was that in the late 60s, in the United States, we had the war in Vietnam, and we had the war on poverty. And we were building a social safety net, making our welfare system more generous. And we start getting some inflation at the end of the 60s. People start blaming that. It's government spending on the war and on the 2 wars, let's say, the military war and the poverty war, that is causing inflation. We need to constrain the government spending because it's inflationary. And so what they did was, if either of you took a microeconomics course, you learn about the consumer budget constraint. Consumers are constrained by their income, which is mostly wages, and by what they can borrow. And they need to be careful about borrowing because they got to make the payments on the debt, and they can go bankrupt. They started applying that for the first time to government itself. They said, the government, just like a consumer, faces a budget constraint. In the case of the government, it is tax revenue plus borrowing. And they need to be careful. If they borrow just like a consumer, they can go bankrupt. And then finally, the government also can print money. And printing money is the most dangerous thing there is, because printing money always leads to hyperinflation. So we can't let the government do that. And so in principle, we prevented the government from being able to print money because the Fed can't buy bonds and just print money like the Bank of England did. Okay? So anyway, this becomes the dogma of economists, and over time, politicians adopted it. They started believing this. And it's completely false, because the analogy is false. The government is not like a household.
What do you think caused the hyperinflation in the 60s and 70s then?
Oh, there wasn't any hyperinflation.
Or sorry, inflation, you're right.
There was some inflation. Yeah,
because hyperinflation is like Weimar Germany, people showing up to pay for loaves of bread with wheelbarrows of worthless marks.
50% inflation rate per month. Per month. Okay, not per year, per month. That's it's somewhat arbitrary, but that's sort of the accepted definition. So no hyperinflation is extremely rare, and it's never caused by the government spending. Never. It's caused by a collapse of the supply side. If your supply collapses, you can end up with hyperinflation. But anyway, in the U.S., like I said, they pointed their fingers at the 2 wars, and labor unions getting too strong because the unemployment rate was low, because we drafted men mostly into the war effort, and the economy was running reasonably hot with a pretty low unemployment rate. So they argued that that was the problem. So we need to cut back government spending. I don't think that was true for the U.S. We didn't really get high inflation until OPEC quadrupled the price of oil. Our inflation came a bit later. So I don't think it was right, even for the U.S. I mean, especially for the U.S. It may have been right for some European countries where labor unions were stronger, where the social safety net was probably better. It's possible that they had too much demand. But I don't think in the case of the US it was. Our inflation came actually later when the unemployment rate was high. What we had in the US all through the 70s was stagflation, which means you have a stagnant economy, high unemployment, and high inflation at the same time. And it was OPEC, both 74 and 79. So we didn't really need to reduce demand. But anyway, that's what gave some credibility to the argument that there was some inflation.
So the idea here is that prices go up because the primary input to the economy, which is petroleum products, suddenly is more expensive and everything goes crazy because there's not enough petroleum to go around to produce things. And so it's not supply collapse, but it's a decrease in supply because it's hard to buy the petroleum.
Well, yes, they're holding oil off the market to get the price up. Yes.
So,
And 1974, the OPEC wanted to get the price up, so they're holding oil off the market. And the U.S. Engineers a recession. The Fed increases interest rates. We may have been already headed toward one, but that added to it, and the price of gasoline is up and feeding through and so on. Now, what would have been a good policy at the time? Conserving oil, conservation, trying to get off oil. That's what Japan did. So when the oil price shock hit, Japan took the other strategy. They became energy efficient. When we had the same energy efficiency in terms of how much oil do you need to produce this unit of output, it was the same in the US and Japan. Japan became twice as energy efficient as we did because they had no oil. We had oil, right? So we just kept using oil. Then OPEC did it again, 1979, quadrupled the price of oil again. What did we do again? Recession. We brought in Volcker, interest rates above 20%. We get our first really deep recession of the post-war period. So we did the wrong policy again. We should have gotten off oil. That was the right response to a supply side shock of just one input, which is oil. And oil immediately goes to food, because in the US, food is oil. 70% of the price of food comes from oil because of pesticide and fertilizer and transportation. So we had the wrong response both times. And just imagine how different the world would be if in 1974 we had moved to get off oil.
Well, it's not entirely clear that's even possible.
I worked for the California Energy Commission, now not in 74, but a couple of years later. Governor Jerry Brown. He was called Governor Moonbeam because he says it is possible. We can do this. Let's move to conservation. And at the Energy Commission, we projected energy demand for the California economy. And the utility companies all wanted to build more capacity because they get a cost plus markup. So whatever the cost is, they get a 15% markup for profits. So they don't care what it costs to build. And they wanted to build more, and they especially wanted nuclear power plants. Governor Moonbeam wanted conservation. And what happened was, it turned out the utility company's projection of demand was like this Energy Commission's projection was like this, we were right consistently. Energy demand did not go up much because conservation was working. So anyway, now I know solar panels were not very well developed at the time, but we would have hurried everything along if we had made that the strategy. Let's conserve and find alternatives. We would be in a much better position now.
So then, oh, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
There's just something about oil that's arms and legs above all the other alternatives in terms of its portability and its energy density and things like nuclear is a great option for sure, but then you need high-end battery technologies, and those are very expensive as well. There's just like not a nice portable alternative to oil.
I think that it's less about finding a pure alternative to oil, though I think that Randy's right that if you set yourself that goal early, you probably get to the outcome
You're like
faster.
supplementing the
You're
power
putting
supply.
money into figuring out how to produce the alternative technologies. At the end of the day, you have to have funding for it. And so if you have funding because you've decided that this is a mandatory step, then all of a sudden you're moving in the right direction. But I'm also thinking about it in terms of conservation being more fuel efficient engines. Convincing people that they don't need to buy useless tchotchkes. This idea of the kind of conservation that was part of the war effort, which is spend less, keep it in your wallet instead of spending it, that also buffers you against a rising price of oil, because if you're buying less.
Is it really the consumers using the oil though? Like, who's the main user of all of this petroleum?
Consumers use the oil not directly, I think, but indirectly, where if you're making something, if you're buying plastic stuff, you're not using the oil, the industry is using the oil, but it must be I don't know that it's a one-to-one relationship, but it's definitely a strong correlation between buying stuff made out of petroleum and the consumption of petroleum.
Transportation, heating and cooling, and beef.
Interesting.
It's like 2.8% of the total petroleum is used residentially.
But residentially is different from the outputs of the economy that you're purchasing. Because if you're buying something that's trucked from, northern Washington, but you're purchasing it in southern Florida, you're not using that petroleum domestically.
It's almost all transportation, I guess.
Yeah, so it's like if you're taking big long road trips, if you're transporting things long distances because you want to be able to have apples year round and you live in Florida, or the reverse, you want to have oranges year round and you live in Washington, like these massive exchanges of goods are the place where, had we conserved in the 70s, we would have been able to buffer those changes and not driven inflation. Is that the principle?
There's lots of things to do. But building more energy efficient housing will make a big difference. And changing diets will make a big difference.
Local diets, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean,
It's like if you could do anything to conserve, it would be minimize transportation costs.
I mean, every time I go to the store and I see blueberries that are from Peru or something, I shudder inwardly. Because, I mean, I love blueberries.
They also taste horrible compared to your locally grown blueberries.
True. You can't get them year round, though. But so, okay. Something about inflation here, then, that makes sense, where it's like you have a price shock because OPEC raises the price of oil, and we're not able to cut demand sufficiently, and so we continue with purchasing this thing that's very expensive. Inflation goes up. In my mind, there's also this aspect of the value of the dollar on the global market for buying imports. And so if the value of the dollar falls, then you also must get inflation because you're having to spend more to get these external resources.
That's a problem for some countries, especially the developing world, that when their currency goes down, and if they're not energy and food self-sufficient, they have to continue importing those. It's not a matter of saying, well, we'll just use less, because they have to, right? If they can't produce their own food or their own energy, they've got to import it. And so this is called pass-through inflation. If their exchange rate goes down, they will get inflation. For the United States, it's much less important. The value of the dollar doesn't fluctuate like the value of developing country currencies, uh, in large part because the US is the international reserve currency. It's in very high demand around the world. We don't have significant runs out of the dollar. We have movements, you know, in the 80s, the US dollar was somewhat challenged by Germany and by Japan. And at the time, it seemed reasonable to believe, you know, there's a chance that either the mark or the yen could take the dollar's place. In retrospect, it seems ridiculous because now we know the history. So Japan, you know, had been in a Japanese miracle of recovery and development, and producing, you know, highly advanced products that could compete easily with United States products. Okay, and so we were buying more and more Japanese stuff, especially cars. If you go to say around 1990, 17, I think, of the world's 20 biggest banks, 17 were Japanese, something like that.
Oh.
It seemed like they were taking over the world. They were taking over the US car market, but also financial markets. So it seemed plausible that the Japanese yen could displace the US dollar, or at least compete as an international reserve currency. And Germany, similar. Recovered from World War II, also producing really advanced technology, industrial products. So at the time, it seemed plausible that this could happen. But of course, what happened was Germany joined the euro, gave up its currency, and the mark was the strong currency in Europe, but it's replaced by the euro, and now it's spread across a variety of countries. Some of them do well, some of them don't do so well. And taken as a whole, this is sort of a different issue. Europe is an exporter and Japan is an exporter, which makes it harder to get their currencies. If you're a foreigner, to get their currencies, you have to borrow them. In the case of the United States, we're an importer. It's easier to get dollars. So in a way, that makes it more convenient because you can export to get dollars. It's preferable to export to get the reserve currency over borrowing to get the reserve currency. If you're borrowing, you have to pay interest. And you owe a debt in the foreign currency. If you're exporting, you earn the currency. So all things equal, the dollar is easier to get, plentiful, because the U.S. is a big importer, and the U.S. economy is very big. And it turned out that Japan had a miracle, and since 1990 has been stuck in a rut. So it's not going to happen. The worry now is that it could be the RMB.
Mm-hmm.
And that's possible. I think inevitable. But when will it happen? It's going to take a long time. The U.S. was more important than UK, say, by the Civil War. We were a bigger economy. But we didn't replace the pound until the end of World War II. So it took 80 years. It's going to take a long time for China to replace the United States, even if it's the biggest economy in the world, because it takes more than that. You need a big economy. You need a currency that's relatively easy to get. not too easy. You know, you don't want too much of it, but easy enough to get. And you have to have institutions that you trust. And the US has built up a reputation for being a country of laws and rules. And for the most part, we follow them. Not 100%. And it could change with different presidents. It could make a difference. But, people trust US financial laws. They trust US courts. And last, they trust the Fed. Because the Fed had a tremendous challenge from 2008 to 2012. The global financial crisis was a crisis of the dollar financial system, the global dollar financial system. The Fed did what it took. It saved the global financial system. The Fed spent and lent $29 trillion to save the global financial system. 40% of that was outside the US because there were dollar liabilities all over the world. And the US became the lender of last resort to the world. And that builds lots of confidence in the US. If the Fed did it that time, they probably will do it again. So it's good to have your liabilities in dollars because if something happens, the Fed will be there to protect you. Do you feel the same way about the Bank of China? Maybe not. That's why I think it's inevitable, but it's not
Imminent.
near.
It's not imminent.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're almost at 3 hours here, but I feel like we just scraped the tip of the iceberg.
I mean, I love conversations where at the end of the conversation, I've gotten to the point where I understand a system well enough to be able to ask a new set of questions. And I think that we've managed that, where I came into this conversation and I was like, I know that this is important. I know that people have spilled a lot of ink about this topic. I don't understand it very well, and I don't understand the moving pieces. And I've gotten to the point where I can say, I have a rough 30,000-foot view that gives me the confidence to be able to ask a new set of questions about a new set of things, especially things looking towards the future and geopolitics and cryptocurrency and
Yeah, I feel like we could have a whole conversation about why that's the inevitability of that change.
Yeah. And so maybe the best that we can hope for is that you'll come back again, because I know that 3 hours is kind of a long stretch of time, but
We can do it again.
that's good news. Do you want to close this off?
I mean, I think that we, like you said, have exposed some really interesting things to ponder. In particular, how we've arrived where we're at, and I do have a good sense of that. As in terms of the future, I feel like it's very unclear to me where all of this is heading, to what extent we will be able to put our own economic interests above those of the other lenders out there. And yeah, I don't know. We need to talk more, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Or fortunately, I suppose.
Can you tell people about...
I really wanted to talk to you about the centrality of war and slavery, which you write about a bunch in your book too. So maybe we can meet up again and talk about those things, because I was really hoping to hear more about that. But I don't know. I think we should let you get on with your day. And, I think people can also only handle so much information in one stretch. I certainly need to digest these ideas a bit. But I really appreciate you giving us the time and bringing us up to speed. And I'm sure the audience is very grateful too.
Before you go, can you tell people where they can find your work, the names of your books, and I think that covers it.
Okay, easiest place to see lots of stuff is at the Levy Institute, www.levy.org. Lots of things by me. Some are pretty simple, like one-pagers. There are policy notes that are written for policymakers. So they're also not very difficult theoretically. And then there's working papers that are generally more academic. And we have lots of Levy scholars. Most of the stuff there is policy oriented across all kinds of policies. I do macro and money, but we have gender, we have developing countries, we have labor markets, so lots of different areas. The books, let me start at the most basic one, Money for Beginners, which is a cartoon book on modern money theory, MMT. And then the next level is Making Money Work for Us. So the first one is even for elementary school kids, up through your grandparents. The second one, high school and above. And then there is Modern Money Theory Primer, which is for a general audience, more detailed than the previous one. Understanding Modern Money. The primer is in its third edition. Third edition just came out, so it includes COVID and the euro, changes in the euro area. Understanding Modern Money, which was the first book on MMT, that's 1998. But I am now doing a new book that includes the MMT portion of that book, but also my first book, 1990, which was the private monetary system. And so I've integrated those to the state money and the private money systems and have a lot more historical detail, some of the stuff we've been talking about. And as you mentioned, the role of slavery in the development of the modern financial system and modern capitalism. For anyone who's interested in financial instability, I have a book on my professor, Hyman Minsky. It's called Why Minsky Matters. And then a whole bunch of other books that are compilations, edited books. There's an encyclopedia of MMT. There's an edited book on secular stagnation. So lots of other books.
Wow.
Excellent.
Yeah, sounds like you've been busy. That's incredible. Yeah,
Let's
I hope
talk
we get to
again.
talk again. This is really fascinating. You filled my brain up. Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful day.
Okay, bye.
Bye, Randy.
Don't
Take care.
forget lunch.